Yes, thanks for coming. Though this is an update, you might remember I did something on kind of preliminary results about a year and a half ago on this. So essentially, I collected a couple choice experiment results and found this funny quirk with impulsiveness and people's preferences and did some kind of back of the envelope modeling. So this is a update where we've replicated it now on 7 different choice experiments. We're doing the full fancy hybrid choice modeling approach. So it's a bit more robust and have a lot to say about it. And we've also looked into identifying this problem and trying to fix it. So it's kind of a bit of a spoiler, right? We're not really going to go up to the end of the presentation unless we identify impulsiveness as a problem in the first place. So this is kind of 2 different papers or components put together. So this first one, again, is something I presented on before, but a bit more robust, an update to it. So just establishing, is impulsiveness a systematic driver of preferences in choice experiments? And then part 2 is figuring out, is this a problem? So should it be a systematic driver of behavior? Or is this an indicator of hypothetical bias? And if so, can we fix that problem? So again, thinking about what I'm talking about with stated preferences for a lot of the, especially we have so many new students here now, you're going to see a lot of choice experiments. So in a choice experiment, we usually show people 2 or more different options and ask them to pick their favorite. And these different options are defined by all these attributes. So this is 2 different local parks. We're saying, this is the average local park in Earth. It has mostly watered grass and a bit of mulch. There's some trees and maybe a playground. And we could change this to something else. We could have a lot more native plants. And it's going to maybe cost you some more money. So we ask people, between these 2 options, what would you pick? And they pick one. And we repeat this over and over again. And we just kind of randomize all the choices and the costs over and over again to figure out, well, how do these different attributes of the thing that we're measuring affect what people want? So an issue with these methods is hypothetical bias. And what this means is that oftentimes people will say that they want things that they wouldn't actually select in real life, right? So in this case, we're looking at these different parks, and people might say, yeah, I really support having this park with all these native plants planted. I think we should get rid of all this watered grass. But it's going to cost them an extra $150 a year over a 5-year span. And in reality, if this were happening, if this were a vote, a lot of people might not actually do that. So they might feel good on a survey saying, I care about the environment, I would spend hundreds of my own dollars on this. But if it came down to it, they might not support it. So often in these stated preference studies, we overestimate willingness to pay for these different goods. And this has become a big topic of figuring out how can we get rid of hypothetical bias and stated preference methods? How can we get rid of this problem? So today I'm going to look at whether we can think about impulsiveness as a driver of hypothetical bias. And once we target that or identify it, if we can figure out different ways of mitigating this source of bias. And I think this is important because very few economists have looked at how individual factors might influence hypothetical bias. So we often will have these different treatments in surveys. We'll make a modification to our choice experiment and see if it makes real behavior and fake hypothetical behavior come more in line. And we'll look at it as an average across the sample. We won't look at who we're actually affecting individually, though. So first off, what is impulsiveness? There's this scientific definition of it. So rapid unplanned reactions to stuff coming your way without regard to negative consequences. So ideally, or essentially what we're looking at is people are very insensitive to costs, people who make quick decisions, and people who have difficulty finishing tasks are kind of 3 hallmark descriptors of people who are impulsive. So you can see how this might link to hypothetical bias if people maybe don't acknowledge financial costs, they make decisions without much thought. They also have difficulty following through with maybe their intended behaviors. Another interesting element of impulsiveness is it's one of the strongest correlates with risk preferences, and that's going to become important in a couple of choice experiments. So it tends to have an extremely high, like a 0.7 correlation with risk preferences. So typically impulsive people are also risk seekers.
Chris, is there a problem? Your slides are not moving on that.
They're not. Cool. Well,
share the screen instead.
Yeah, I'll share the screen instead. All right.
Next to the
On the right.
next to the
Let's go entire screen.
It's usually the best option.
There we go. Great. We're back. Sorry about that.
Yep, that's better. Fixed.
So a few people have looked at impulsiveness and stated preferences, but it's received relatively little attention. So when we're looking at what most people have looked at for psychological traits and stated preferences, it's been big 5 personality traits, risk preferences, or often perceptions of whatever good we're valuing. So there's one paper that's really directly looked at this. This is with a co-author now, Jürgen Meyerhoff and Peter Mariel. And they just did this as an exercise of showing how you could integrate psychological traits into our choice models. And they didn't really look at what it meant. And towards the end of their paper, they said, we think this is maybe linked to risk-seeking behaviors. We think that maybe risk seekers are more likely to support stuff generally, such as forest conservation, which I'm not too sure if I can draw the same link in my head. Another paper is by Fisher and Hanley. So Nick Hanley was looking at, they were typifying decisions, so not decision makers, but they were interviewing people, this old school CV method of going to someone's house and sitting down and talking to them. And the evaluator actually made judgments about whether they thought the decision was impulsive or not. So they defined impulsive decisions as highly emotional and reactive with little cognitive thought or elaboration. So they were interesting. They thought that this was going to lead to protest responses. So people saying no to everything. But then when they actually went through their analysis, they found that it didn't happen. And then kind of related to this is there's been some research on impulsiveness and intention behavior gaps. So this idea that in surveys, you'll ask people, you know, would you recycle? Would you take the bus more? Would you do all these things that are good for the environment? And impulsive people say, yes, I would do all those things. And then when they measure actual behavior, they don't do them. So again, all this ammunition that makes it seem like impulsiveness might be a driver of hypothetical bias.
Can I just ask a question? On that slide, when you say impulsiveness, do you mean speed?
No, so speed is different. That's actually, I looked at speed before. They're correlated somewhat weakly. So to jump ahead, I did some heteroscedastic models before. I was basically looking at, did impulsiveness just lead to people randomly selecting things in the survey? And at first, it was a weak determinant of just kind of randomness. But then I found out that the real driver of randomness was speed. So people who just clicked through the survey really fast were more random. And impulsive people were a bit faster, but once you controlled for time, impulsiveness wasn't a determinant of randomness.
Okay, so something else that you're measuring.
Yeah.
Measuring speed.
So I'm measuring impulsiveness using a psychometric scale. So in our survey here, what we're looking at is, does impulsiveness affect stated preferences? So if that's a yes, we want to know, does impulsiveness affect real behavior or not? And then if it does affect preferences, which it will, and if it doesn't affect real behavior, which maybe it won't, this would imply that impulsive people are more prone to hypothetical bias. And we wanted to figure out, can we come up with an intervention that really just taps into that impulsiveness and corrects for it? So what we did is I snuck some psychometric questions to measure impulsiveness or impulsivity into a lot of other surveys. So these are questions, these are Likert scale ratings. So all these statements, something like, I act quickly without thinking. I struggle to follow through with tasks. I don't consider negative consequences of anything that I do. So you get people to rate all of these things, and we're going to use those as a measure of what people are saying in all these different stated preference tasks. So first, we have 3 different choice experiments on biodiversity and species conservation. This is a national sample, I'm pretty sure. Yes, Michael nodded. I've got one on earthquake risk mitigation. So this is a Western Australian sample. So looking at, would you pay more to avoid damages of earthquakes in rural Western Australia? One on urban park preferences, that's what you saw before. And then one on the adoption of native birch gardens. So this is a little strip of land in front of your house, trying to figure out, would you put native plants there instead of watering grass all the time? So the interesting parts of all these surveys is the earthquake one. We're going to be able to target impulsiveness versus risk preferences, since these are so highly correlated. We'd expect risk avoiders to want to support risk mitigation, and we would expect impulsive people maybe to not want to invest in risk mitigation then, because they're also risk seekers. The urban park preferences is interesting because in that one, our status quo alternative, so our do nothing alternative, isn't the low cost one. So in most of these surveys, the do nothing status quo is also the one in which there's no tax increase. In that one, it's not the case. And then the native garden one is interesting, so we have real behavior to compare to their stated preferences. So modeling wise, as I said, so these are all the little statements that people rate. So what we're going to end up doing is we're going to say that the choice attributes and impulsiveness are going to affect utility. So how much happiness people get out of selecting these different alternatives, and that utility is going to affect the choice that they make. So we can't directly observe impulsiveness. So what we do is we have people rate all these questions and we do some fancy modeling. And what we get is basically we just make a bell curve of people and we can figure out where on that bell curve people are relative to each other. So it's just going to be a mean zero variable. And we can say, well, you are more impulsive by this distance or you are less impulsive by this distance. And we can look at then what I'm going to focus on are the odds of people picking the status quo alternative in these situations, in these experiments, or their average willingness to pay across that bell curve. And so everything else, all the non-cost attributes are random normal variables. So it's going to fully account for all the different unobserved heterogeneity sources in these models too, to really sharpen in on the effect of impulsiveness. So going into our biodiversity study, so this is 3 different survey treatments. So in this one, the status quo is that do nothing. So it's essentially we're saying biodiversity is declining. All these species might go extinct. You could pay nothing and nothing's going to change and we're on this bad trajectory, or you can pay money and biodiversity isn't going to be as bad in the future and there's going to be less species extinctions and less risk to different endangered species. So it's always that do nothing versus a couple other alternatives. So in all 3 treatments, we found that, and the other alternatives had a tax increase associated with them, right? So improvements in biodiversity and a tax increase. So in all 3 of these treatments, we found that impulsive people were less responsive to tax increases than unimpulsive people. They weren't directly less likely to pick the status quo, but because the status quo was the zero cost option, they kind of indirectly were, right? So they were less responsive to tax increases, so they were more likely to pick other options. And because their cost parameter was smaller, that meant they were willing to pay more for everything, right? So our willingness to pay is how much happiness people get out of, say, avoiding a species extinction, divided by how much happiness they get out of money. And having that smaller cost parameter implies that impulsive people get less happiness out of their money. Therefore, they're willing to pay more for everything.
Or as they say they do.
At least they say they do, right? So it's probably not true. So here's just some plots. The top is the percent likelihood of them picking the status quo alternative, the do nothing alternative. And the bottom is their willingness to pay. I just picked a species at random from each survey. And you can see across all 3 surveys, to varying degrees, impulsive people were less likely to pick the status quo, and they were willing to pay more money for everything. You can also see the confidence intervals on willingness to pay goes pretty wide the higher you get on that impulsiveness scale, and that's because that cost parameter, remember, it's the denominator of our willingness to pay, that cost parameter is getting very close to 0. So for that reason, it's just kind of blowing up. We're saying these people are willing to pay thousands of dollars, except it's like between -500 and +2,500. So it's very uncertain, but a very high mean average. So you could see how that would maybe be inflating our willingness to pay estimates in these surveys, if those people are present. So next we looked at an earthquake risk study. So again, the status quo in this one is don't do anything. And the other alternatives are there's going to be a tax increase and we're going to reduce the damages of earthquakes to a rural town in Western Australia, in York. So we're going to have less of a mental health burden on the people there, less destruction of heritage buildings, and less of a disruption following an earthquake to the people living in the town. So in this one, we found that impulsiveness was linked to a lower likelihood of selecting the status quo. So they were more likely to pick another option. So the tax interaction wasn't significant in this one, but the status quo was. So it's kind of opposite of what happened in the species one. But again, in these 2 choice experiments, because that status quo is linked to the zero tax alternative, it's correlated. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly what the true effect is there. So in this case, I'm looking at, well, what's the likelihood of picking the status quo alternative? You can see as impulsiveness goes up, as you're higher on that scale, the odds of picking the status quo goes down quite substantially. And if we look at sort of the negative willingness to pay of doing nothing, so how much are these people hurt by not acting on fortifying the town of York from earthquakes, you can see that the higher the level of impulsiveness, the worse off these people are, meaning they'd be technically willing to pay more money to avoid earthquake risks in York overall. So parks, this was an interesting one because, again, you could see that base scenario wasn't necessarily linked to a tax or zero tax. So basically the new option could be a more or less expensive option. So now we're trying to figure out, is it the fact that impulsive people are picking the new thing, or are impulsive people insensitive to costs? And in this study, we found out impulsive people were picking the new thing and they were less sensitive to costs, which is great because now I don't have to think about why it went wrong in this one. So in this case, though, the interaction with the status quo was significant, but it was pretty small in magnitude. So you can see if we're looking at the odds of selecting the status quo across the percentiles of impulsiveness, it's pretty subtle. It's a significant effect, but it's really small. But this is the willingness to pay. So I think this is the willingness to pay for a 1% increase in the amount of watered grass. So you can see the average person is willing to pay about $7 for more watered grass. Really impulsive people are willing to pay $14 with a big standard error. But you could say that about everything. They're willing to pay more for trees. They're willing to pay more for grass. They're willing to pay more for mulch. They're willing to pay more for native vegetation. So basically they just said, yeah, we like everything more. It doesn't matter what it is, which is maybe a bit problematic. So they're willing to pay more for everything. So looking at our results so far, we can see these somewhat consistent results. The parks has both significant, and we have these confounding effects between the status quo and the tax in all the other ones where it's just one or the other, right? So again, the status quo is the zero tax alternative. So it's hard to infer what exactly is happening there. So at this point in the experiment this was pretty fun. I was in Germany. We were both in Germany, Claire and I was at lunch with Richard Thaler, and he said, tell me the most interesting research discovery you've recently made. So I said, impulsive people say yes to everything. And he responded and he said, that's ridiculous. I would expect the opposite. I would expect they wouldn't get anything done. So then I had to clarify and said, well, actually, yeah, I'm dealing with stated behavior. So I think they're maybe just saying they would do everything, but they wouldn't actually follow through with it. And he said, that makes more sense. So it was good because I presented this before, and there's a lot of debate about, is this true preferences? Is this hypothetical bias? And it was just like a good little litmus test to kind of bring it up with Richard Thaler and him to say, like, there's no way impulsive people are actually doing all these things. And it linked really well to a talk I heard earlier that day by Daniel McFadden, looking at this is real behavior on Medicare plans in the United States. So he was looking at this idea of inattention, acuity, all of these different elements that lead people to essentially just choose not to choose in real life. So what happened with Obamacare is everyone got put on health plans, on pharmacare plans, and a lot of these plans change over time. Your reality changes over time. And they found that a huge amount of Americans have selected plans that are completely dominated by other plans. So you could save hundreds or thousands of dollars a year and get a plan that gives you better coverage. And a lot of people aren't changing plans every single year. And they were looking at this idea of people just are a bit inattentive. People have a lot of trouble following through with plans and doing what's right for them in real life. So we kind of talked a bit about how there's a bit of a parallel there maybe in what's going on, that if you force people to make a decision, maybe they'll make a good decision, or maybe they'll make a certain decision, but they wouldn't follow through with that in reality. I should also say at this point, Claire was in like it was like a bit of a heat wave, and Claire was in an attic in Lindau coding our next survey, getting all of our results ready. So I went home this day and I was super excited, and Claire was very hot and bored. And she said, I finished doing all the coding for our recent survey on native verge adoption. And I was like, great, we need to check this thing out because Richard Thaler thinks that we're going to find something interesting. So this is a study where we're asking people, would you convert your verge, this tiny little strip of land in front of your house, to a native garden? So typically it's watered grass for most people. And the nice thing about this is that these policies that we're outlining in our choice experiment are real. So this is kind of the most common policy suite that you'll see around town is that people can receive $500 after they convert their verge. They'll get 50% off plants. They do the work themselves. So the great thing about this is that we can look at impulsiveness as a determinant of these stated preferences, and then we can also ask people, do you actually have a native garden, and look at whether it affects their real preferences, their real adoption behavior. So looking at our stated preference results here, we had two different versions of this questionnaire. We had a willingness to pay, so we said you could pay to have it all done for you, or you could get a subsidy and do all the work yourself. So again, it was significant in both models, much more significant in the willingness to accept model. And you can see that more impulsive people, less likely to select the status quo. That's another way of saying more impulsive people were more likely to say, yeah, I'll put a native garden on my verge. But then when we did a model of real behavior, impulsive people were no more likely than unimpulsive people to have a native garden on their verge. So this is nice. We actually have some calibration that we can do here between our real and stated preferences. So far it's looking bad for impulsiveness. So now to summarize our results again, same thing as before, this consistent effect. It seems as though impulsive people are less responsive to costs, more willing to say they'll do anything on stated preference studies. So this also got me thinking about another cool talk I saw about behavioral economics and biases. So Robert Aumann was saying that, basically saying that most biases that psychologists and economists are finding in behavioral economics aren't truly biases. So he says that usually they're based on heuristics that tend to benefit people in like 99% of scenarios. And these psychologists and behavioral economists are coming up with these really weird, contrived scenarios in the lab that contort people into making dumb decisions, and that these scenarios would never exist in reality. So he's calling those contrived situations, and got me thinking about choice experiments as contrived situations, of thinking how often are you just browsing the internet or doing something, and then all of a sudden you're just prompted with some issue you've never thought about in your life, and with a click of a mouse, you could just spend hundreds of dollars, right? It doesn't happen. And it's actually a pretty well-researched area when it comes to figuring out how we can get people to spend more money and impulse purchases. So Amazon has become a pioneer in this space in that you get people to sign on to Amazon, which takes a lot of effort initially. You put in your delivery address, you put in your credit card details. But once you're set up, you can just do single-click purchasing now. So that's what they're trying to get at. But if you look at this problem across e-commerce, is that a lot of times people will go online shopping intentionally, and they'll click, yeah, I want to buy that, and they're going to put it in their shopping cart. And depending on the study you look at, it looks like the majority of shopping carts, the majority of the time people click on something online and say, I'm going to buy that, they don't actually buy it. There's a lot of different reasons for it. Sometimes it's that they're going to think about it more. Sometimes they're just doing research. Sometimes they're putting a lot of things in the cart and taking things out. But it got me thinking about, maybe we need to give people extra clicks in a survey to really confirm that they want to go ahead with a behavior or buy something. Maybe it's problematic that we're making it so easy for people to spend hypothetical dollars that don't actually exist. So we tried to focus on this impulsiveness intervention in our survey by following up every time that someone said yes in our Verge survey to a scenario. We said, moments ago, you said you would do this if we paid you X dollars. Now that you've had a bit more time to think about it, would you still go ahead with your native Verge adoption? So we did this a couple different ways. We did this for all yes choices again. I varied when they saw this. So some people saw this after we basically said, did you attend to costs? Did you think the survey was meaningful? And then they just saw this right away. The other half of the people had to answer those impulsiveness psychometrics before they answered it. And that actually didn't have an effect, which is great. So what we found is that of our yeses, so about half of our responses were yeses initially, about 16% of our yeses got converted to no's after we did this. So basically people had between 30 seconds and a minute between their first response and their second response. And then about 16% of those yeses went and got converted to no's. So did our intervention work? Well, we can actually compare our willingness to accept results with our true adoption results because these policies actually exist, right? So I can take our model results, I can set all the policy levels to the real policy level. So I did a weighted average of policies because every local government has their own policies in Perth. So based on our sample, I had a weighted average of the real policy. I looked at our predicted adoption. So our real adoption rate was about 14%. So 14% of respondents had a native garden. And our initial, so using our first choice, our model said 22% of people will have a native garden if the real policy level exists. So that's bad, right? I guess subjectively, it's only 9% inflation over the true adoption rate. But if you look at it as far as an increase over the base adoption, it's about a 40% increase in adoption rate. So if we use our follow-up choice, all of a sudden it looks like we corrected for that problem, right? So if we use the first choice, their first click, 22% of people said, I would have a native garden at this current rate. If we use the follow-up choice, it's down to about 12%. So it's in line with real behavior now. So I think it looks like we fixed the impulsiveness problem. So nailed it. And this is hopefully, I want this to be like, yeah, this is a bit of foreshadowing. So what's interesting though is if I run this choice model, so I can run this choice model on the first choice people made or that second choice when they were able to undo their yes response, and impulsiveness is still a driver of stated preferences. So it looked like we corrected for this hypothetical bias source. So basically we're saying people are impulsive people say they're more likely to do it, they won't actually do it. Let's make them answer a second time. The goal there was that I was hoping that unimpulsive people were going to have nice, stable preferences. And if they saw the choice card again a minute later, they were going to say, yeah, I just said yes. Stop bothering me. And then maybe impulsive people, if forced to slow down, were going to change their response. But actually, it had an equal effect on everyone. So our results came in line, but we actually still have this kind of confirmed source of hypothetical bias present in our sample. So the problem now is it seems like maybe we over-influence some people into incorrectly saying no when they're a true yes. Meanwhile, we have a lot of other people in our sample saying yes when they're a true no. So while our average prediction rate went right in line with real behavior, it's possible that we didn't more accurately model people's true preferences, right? We may have just kind of like muddled it up a lot and gotten lucky with that right answer. So I think the problem here is that we're not usually looking at individual differences when we're looking at measures to mitigate hypothetical bias, right? We've got cheap talk scripts, we've got the opt-out reminder is one where in the wording of the question, it says, you must select the status quo if you don't think you can afford the other alternative. Like it's really prescriptive, it's really strong language. There's the certainty adjustments where afterwards you say, how certain were you of your choice? And if people say anything but very certain, they get recoded as a no. There's all these different things. And in various contexts, people say, we corrected for hypothetical bias. And then someone reproduces it in their study and they undercorrect for it or they overcorrect for it. And it's just kind of random. So I think what this is showing us is that if we don't tap into individual differences and understand how these measures affect people differently, we don't actually know if we're fixing the problem. It's possible that we're telling a lot of people who would actually support a cause in real life to say no, and a lot of people who are saying yes, but when they wouldn't actually say yes in real life are just maintaining their answer. So it's possible that we're not actually improving anything. We're just kind of randomizing results a bit more. So I guess the summary of these papers is that I think we've confirmed that impulsiveness is a consistent driver of preferences. Stated preferences. I think we have reasonable evidence based on our results as well as some supporting stuff from the psych literature that impulsiveness is a driver of hypothetical bias. And then I think we also illustrated that in our effort to correct for impulsiveness, that it's really important to understand who these mitigative measures are affecting, because it's possible you're not actually doing what you think you did. So we thought we fixed impulsiveness, and then we ran the models again, and the effect was still there. So it just illustrates how careful you need to be in meddling in these stated preference techniques. That's it. Happy to have a discussion now. Thanks. Ben?
You consider doing a lab experiment where you eliminate hypothetical bias and then you test impulsiveness?
I would love to. I've had a couple thoughts on that. One, so the question was, have I considered doing a lab experiment for this? And yeah, I think that'd be great. You need money, but that would be great. The other thing I thought about too is I was looking at some literature. The papers weren't the strongest, but they were suggesting that impulsive people can be affected by different payment mediums. So saying that if you make people pay cash, impulsive and unimpulsive behavior starts aligning a bit more. So it's possible you could do the classic experiment of you have a pool of money and you're going to get it at the end, and you can just click buttons and see what happens. I wondered if you actually gave people coins and made them physically spend their coins between rounds, if that would affect impulsiveness.
I have an impulsive daughter who's shredded with a credit card.
Okay, there's truth. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, we have multiple questions from Stephen.
Cool.
Stephen, can you unmute yourself? Can you unmute yourself?
Oh, okay, sure. Well, maybe, I don't know. It might be better if you read them to everybody because they can hear you better, I imagine. Than if I...
We can hear really well. We can hear you great.
Okay, I've got actually three questions, a three-part of the same one, so I'll read three parts of it, but it's really one question, I think. So I'll read it out then. Curtis, do you think this is related to so-called rather extreme voters switching from one extreme of the political spectrum to the other? For example, as you see in several countries, from the far left to neo-Nazi, for example. Perhaps, well, in relation to that, would you say that with impulsiveness, some emotion, some kind of emotion kicks in before rationality has time to do anything? And that would probably be related to Kahneman's fast thinking, and slow thinking, where the first one kicks in before the second one does, because of emotion kicking in, sort of trumping, so to speak, the other one. And okay, the last point is a different point actually. It's about heterogeneity. The one that we see here on the slide, the last one, heterogeneity is a big challenge to our analysis, and I don't know how far we've gone down that road. Often we simplify that to say two categories, sometimes three, but it could be a lot more than that. It could even be a quasi-continuum, and it becomes pretty hard to analyze that, particularly in multidimensional space. So I thought that there was a question as well. Yeah, I don't know. I'll let you answer.
Thanks, Steve. I think so. Question one is actually, that would be interesting to look at. Claire and I are actually looking at something with Sven right now on polarized responses. So you remember he presented on vignettes and said, there's all these people who just keep saying 10 out of 10, 0 out of 10, 5 out of 10 over and over again. And we were looking at using latent class models to look at polarized responses to that. And I think impulsiveness would actually be really interesting to look at in that case. And in that case,
you'd have to disentangle impulsive to something else that could drive this, all 10 or all 0, which is I don't really care or whatever. It's I'm not taking this seriously.
Yeah, that's why it would be important to have that sort of. I think a latent class approach is so good for that sort of thing, because then you can look at the different reasons why people are in those classes, and it could be a combination of protest responders just saying, I don't care, get me through the survey, and impulsiveness. I think that's a smart one. On question, I'll go to question 3 next. Question 3 is interesting because there's a lot of talk about these integrated choice latent variable models, and the punchline of all of them is, it's a worthless practice because we don't improve our model fit, which is kind of like what every economist is saying. We're really concerned with just like looking at the average effect. And we're saying, I guess you can learn more about why people made the decisions they made, but we didn't improve model fit, so who cares? Which is such an economist thing to do. Like, we didn't improve our forecasts, so it doesn't matter why people made the decisions they made. But I think this is I think it is important to understand that this heterogeneity, understanding why the heterogeneity exists, is really important. And I'm drawing a blank on question 2. I didn't bring a notepad because I'm a big idiot. Oh yeah, the Kahneman's two-system thinking. I thought about that a lot too. Yeah, again, about system 1 versus system 2. I think that makes perfect sense, right? This is very much an emotional response, a quick emotional response with little cognitive thought. So I think what this is saying is that impulsive people are more prone to, you know, that system relative to unimpulsive people. So I think it's that impulsive people can have thoughtful, careful, cognitive thoughts, but they're less likely to have them, and unimpulsive people are less likely to be just quick and emotional. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Just one thing that what you said earlier a bit made me, from your results, it made me ask the question that might be of interest to you. But in some circumstance, under some conditions, impulsiveness, whatever, you know, however, whatever that covers, might exaggerate a response relative to the, say, more rational one, and in other circumstances, it might dampen it, and yet in another circumstance, it might kind of prevent any response because it fixes the response in a sort of like a frozen thing. You know, they just don't really listen. They respond, if you want to call it impulsively, in a sort of what's called constant mode. It's not really responding to changes in the stimuli that you're giving them. It just made me think about this, and I don't know whether you've thought about it too, and whether in your studies you want to have a look at that.
I know I feel like this is the thing about this topic, is it's just opening a lot of streams of future research that I could go down if I so choose. So we'll just wait. I feel like I've taken this quite far so far, and I'm not. Yeah, we'll see what happens next. But yeah, thanks, Steve. Emma? Yeah.
I may have missed this, but in all of the studies that you input those questions, was the percentage consistent in terms of the number of respondents exhibiting impulsiveness across all those, or were there different percentages across each one?
Yeah, okay. So I guess I didn't look at that specifically. So part of it too is that the annoying part about impulsiveness, the gold standard scale is 30 questions long. It's very long. So in the first couple of studies, I only put 3 or 4 questions in. So I could look a little bit comparatively to see if people were more or less impulsive. And then partway through, I found a shortened scale that is pretty good and is only 8 questions long and gets a more all-encompassing. So I think moving forward with that 8-question scale, I could really start digging into that better. But that is a good question. And that's something I'm kind of kicking myself over, because if you look at the psych literature, they don't necessarily have like a binary, are they impulsive, yes, no, but they often do report average impulsiveness scores based on all of these different studies, from anything from have they tried MDMA before to are they a murderer to everything in between of looking at the average scores. So I think that'd be interesting if we could actually compare these Gen Pop studies and where people are on the spectrum to, you know, love drug users and murderers. But that's something for future research as well. Yeah. Perfect.
So do you think, you know, the framing of the question would actually also affect your answer? Because if it's framed positively or negatively, and also if you then, you know, normally when you do scaling, right, you would have like questions to actually try to check whether, you know, it's consistent, the consistency, internal consistency. So did you have like, you know, to correct for that potential bias, have positively framed and negatively framed question, which is actually answering the same, you know, it's dealing with the same question?
Yeah, in the impulsiveness scales. Yeah. So this one, the first one had a range, and I tried to skillfully take a nice range of positive and negative questions. And then the second scale is more of like a complete validated scale. There's positive and negatively phrased ones. What is interesting is that people generally, you don't get a lot of 5 out of 5s on the response scales either, which is maybe something worth digging into a bit more. So you get some variation, but it's not like most psychometric scales where you have some people in your sample that were all 1s and some people that were all 5s. Like you maybe have one person who said 5 out of 5 to all the impulsiveness things. So yeah.
And the other thing is also in terms of, because of course this is about impulsiveness, but did you look at other confounding effects, from other variables? A good example is, for example, like one of our students, Vivek, he found out that when he was looking at willingness to pay, if the person has already experienced flooding, then their answer would be very different from a hypothetical question if the other person have never experienced flooding.
Yeah.
So.
No, we didn't look at anything else. I mean, the ideal answer to that is we've got mixed with everything's random parameters. It all comes out in the unobserved heterogeneity wash. Yeah, but no, it's a good idea.
That's really interesting. I had a question about your when you talk about the verges and the true adoption rate. That was people who had already got a native verge.
Yeah.
Who say they have?
Who say they have?
Okay, so there's a couple of things about that because I don't know quite how that works in terms of a question asking people, would you accept some money to do something if you got it?
So we had a special version of the survey for those people where we said, so if you already had one, we said, look, there's all these different policy options. These may or may not have existed when you adopted your verge. So had this package been offered to you at the time, would you have adopted? So I know it's a little less removed from real behavior when you're saying, hypothetically, would you have made the same decision if this was on offer?
So they're getting slightly different framed questions.
Slightly, yeah.
I'm thinking also about the idea about comparing about true adoption rate, because for the people who haven't got one, and you're saying they said they would,
yeah, but
they may not know about the incentive scheme. So I would think that really, this is easy to say, you just take a couple more years, but
yeah,
basically give people an information leaflet about the existing incentive scheme.
Yeah.
But the good thing about verges is you don't have to, you just go back and check their verge.
I know.
For a year.
Yeah.
Because then it's a real thing of, with this information, would you take the money and do it?
Yeah.
Because I may not know there were $500 available. So it's a bit hard to say, I set up to do it, but I haven't previously done it.
It's true.
Might be ignorance. Yeah.
It could be ignorance. So, that is a source. That is a down.
So I think that's really interesting. But I mean, without getting a bit stalkerish, do you know where they live?
Yeah, we don't know where they live.
You could just observe their verge.
I know. That would be great. And I wondered about that too. I don't know. I question about the awareness thing too, because when we talked to a lot of the policymakers around it, they said the biggest issue is that people, it's like timing and coordination issues. You sign up for these programs, but typically you sign up for them 6 to 8 months in advance. And at that time, you're supposed to tear up your lawn and then let the soil kind of regenerate to what it used to be. And then 8 months later, you get your discounted plants and you plant them. And then after 6 or 8 months from that, you get the rebate. So what they said is that people don't follow. The main issue they have is that people don't follow through because it's a 1.5 year time span. So I think on one hand, they may not be aware, but the big issue that these policymakers have is that people are signing up and never following through anyway when they are aware. So it's hard to figure out.
That adds another layer to
it's so much
in adoption status, because the choice set makes it look very easy.
Yeah.
$500 bang, you get your bird.
Oh, we told people before too that like this is gonna take a year or two. Okay. This is going to be but that's a good point when it comes to discount rates and the subsidy that we did not even acknowledge, which I don't want to get into. The 2-year delay on the subsidy. Thanks. I think we're good at 11:48. 2 minutes.
Well, obviously, impulsiveness is a source of heterogeneity. But I think back to the first surveys, which you said were more like conservation or biodiversity based. So in those, we're trying to like recreate a market, a hypothetical market.
Yeah.
But in markets, people are impulsive.
Yeah.
Like in shops, people go into shops and buy washing machines.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Recreate a market. I was wondering, like, is impulsiveness really a problem?
Yeah, that was the first question that I had too, of thinking like, is impulsive? The question is just, is
heterogeneity is important.
is impulsiveness just actually reflective of true preferences in a lot of these markets for conservation? And it's possible. I guess the question now is that what we're finding is because they're supportive of all causes, you kind of have to call it into question because you have a constrained budget, and all of a sudden impulsive people are saying, spend $600 on the town of York, spend $600 on the endangered species, upgrade my verge, upgrade my park. And they don't have that much money. So I think that's maybe the downside, is that it could be a driver of true preferences, but it may also just be like, it's hard to know, like if maybe we need a different type of choice experiment setting to figure out what they would actually commit their money to if they actually had all of these competing environmental interests. Would it still be there? Would they just put their spending up to $10,000 a year?
Oh, I think they end up with a lot of debt sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Top up their credit card.
I know, yeah.
But you found that in the verge that one that it did decrease, or actual adoption or stated adoption decreased when you gave them the chance to reconsider. Well, it wasn't the.
But it wasn't the impulsive people. It was everyone. That's the problem.
Yeah, right.
I know. So.
Society corrected for itself.
Yeah.
I know.
How lucky.
There is one question from online attendee.
Level 3.
Okay.
Okay. Well.
Okay.
Any insight or any impulsiveness comparing online shopping and shop shopping?
I haven't seen. I need to look at it more. So this is the problem. There's impulsiveness as a personality trait and impulsiveness as a definition of a situation, right? And most of the marketing literature is looking at impulsiveness, defining a context as impulsive as opposed to a person. And I think that's the hardest part, is that impulsiveness as a personality trait kind of is in there. Sometimes it's really hard to sift through and find those ones as opposed to creating impulsive situations. So yeah, not a lot, but a bit.
For coming to this seminar.